To discuss how resilience can work for everyone, please welcome Anjali Mahendra, Director of the Ross Center for Sustainable Cities at WRI, Lisa McNeilly, the City of Baltimore's Director of Sustainability, and Carlos Martín, a Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute. Here to lead the conversation is journalist Kathleen Koch.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, panelists. I'm so excited to be here today to talk about resilience because my hometown on the Mississippi Gulf Coast is probably one of the most resilient small towns in America today. That because it was destroyed by Hurricane Katrina and virtually had to be rebuilt from the ground up. So because of new flood maps, new zoning, new building codes, what was rebuilt higher, stronger, smarter, further back from the water. You know, we have a protective seawall, the bridges are higher. But Carlos, I know that starting over with a blank slate is not exactly the blueprint that we really hope cities will have to follow. So what would you say are the most successful strategies toward becoming climate resilient that cities should be following, and are enough of them following these strategies?
And the answer to the second question is easy. No, there aren't enough cities that are doing enough, and most of the cities aren't doing enough on their own. I would say, to be fair, though, most cities are trying to do what they can.
With what they have.
With what they have. There are some so we've been evaluating cities throughout the United States in terms of their climate adaptation policies. There are things that cities are doing internally that I think are very helpful, as well as what they're doing on the ground, trying to get projects in place, trying to rethink how their neighborhoods are structured.
So what kinds of things? I mean, if they haven't started, where should they start?
The first thing they should start with is understanding the science. What are the risks that they face, not just sea level rise and severe precipitation events, but also heat waves, potential drought, as we see in the Southwest. And there are at least 15 climate change effects that I think we often forget with the visuals that we see about sea level rise and hurricanes. And so it's important to think about all the consequences. That's just to start off with. And I think thinking through how to de-silo within their city governments, I think, is the next big challenge.
So making climate resilience, really folding it into everything that they do.
Into everything, and making sure that your public works person talks to your housing person, talks to your public health person. This often doesn't happen, especially in very large cities that are huge bureaucracies. It's hard for people to walk down the hallway and say, how do we figure this out?
Lisa, does that happen in Baltimore? Are things siloed? And what are you doing to make Baltimore a more climate resilient city? I happened to be there in 2003 reporting on Hurricane Isabel and the effects. It pushed a 10-foot storm surge into the city and terrible devastation in Fells Point, some in the Inner Harbor. So what are you doing to make it resilient not only to that, but to the day-to-day effects of climate change that you're seeing?
Yeah, we're working on that issue. I wouldn't quite say our departments are siloed from we don't want to talk to each other, but we're siloed because we have so many problems that we're trying to address. There are large infrastructure problems. There are the problems that you know from the news around the safety, the vacant lots, But what we've started where we can. So my office is in the planning department, and so we've integrated climate adaptation into the all hazard mitigation plan that FEMA requires us to do. And so that's a first step at bringing everybody together to try to look at what are the priorities to do on this. We're working to then integrate those strategies and actions into our capital planning program, which unusually is also run out of the planning department in Baltimore. So that gives us a bit of an entry point in terms of having agencies think about how they're spending that limited capital money.
Speaking of limited, I mean, how hard is that in Baltimore right now? Because of the infrastructure crisis, I mean, you touched on that. I think you're about $1 billion behind in spending just on general maintenance. So how do you even afford mitigation and resilience planning?
Well, one of the things we're working to do is to get people around the table to do an integrated planning so that when if Department of Public Works is looking at stormwater projects improvements, we know that they're also aware of where there are needs around flooding issues, so that those things can kind of happen at the same time, as opposed to it assuming that there's two pots of money, because there's really only the one.
Getting more bang for the buck.
More bang for the buck. Yes.
Anjali, let's look internationally. How would you say cities on the international level are doing when it comes to addressing climate change? Are they facing some of these same challenges that U.S. cities are?
Absolutely. That segue on, how do you find the resources to do this? It's common to Baltimore. It's common to, any of the major cities around the world and the growing cities that we're talking about. The bigger challenge, I would say, in the international context is that if you look at where urban populations are growing right now, the fastest, they're the countries that have the least resources. Sub-Saharan Africa, we're talking about South Asia, we're talking about Southeast Asia, some of Latin America. You have urban populations growing. You already have a crisis in terms of access to services. There are severe deficits. There's certainly lower resources. These are lower income countries. And you have pretty strong, severe governance challenges. Just having the mechanisms to plan and deliver on those plans do not exist in so many of these cities. So there are some shining examples we can talk about. There's places like Surat in India, there's Cape Town in South Africa, where unfortunately it's always been driven by a crisis. There was a day zero in Cape
Just
Town.
like in the U.S.
And the institutions come together, the agencies come together, and that spurs action, and that's great, but we don't want to wait for that crisis. Same thing in Surat, year upon year of flooding. A river runs through the city, and now they have early warning systems integrated into their planning. Their infrastructure delivery takes climate risks into account. So there are a few good examples, but far too few still. That's the problem.
Carlos, I saw some headlines in the last month, and one gave me hope, and one was depressing. One was talking
Welcome
about
to the climate world.
one was talking about Norfolk, Virginia, and some other vulnerable areas, also Vermont, where they were taking a new strategy, and the headline said, a tough strategy, saying no to developers. But then I saw a Wall Street Journal headline that says, despite wildfires and drought, California keeps building. So how do we get through to elected officials? This is a long-term problem. There's no guarantee that there is going to be a payoff while they're still in office for these mitigation measures, for taking steps to make their communities climate resilient.
Craig Fugate, former FEMA administrator, used to say, the way he would convince cities and states is by thinking about their long-term revenue, where they're going to get their tax base from. And so it's a way of thinking not just about immediate development opportunities, but how you're actually investing in the current communities that already live in your jurisdiction. It's ultimately going to take a lot of leadership and really inspiration among specific politicians and elected officials. And there are examples of places, and I always quote Satellite Beach, Florida, where the mayor and the city manager are very conservative, to use the vernacular climate denial kind of community right on the coast, and the mayor and city manager said, we have to do something about this. We're flooding all the time now. And basically stepping up to the plate and saying we have to make hard choices, regardless of how you feel about what the sources are.
And even when those tough choices reduce your population, I mean, what about managed retreat and buyouts?
That's the next frontier in climate adaptation plan, and I think that we're barely just beginning to have the conversations around. There are only 2 or 3 examples of formal federally funded relocation.
Right. Louisiana and Alaska.
Exactly. And a lot of states are actually been doing this for quite some time, right, through specific buyout programs, et cetera.
Charlotte.
Yeah, I think the challenge is how connected that and committed that elected official is to the communities, to all the populations that live in their jurisdiction, in her or his jurisdiction. I think that's the real challenge, and how that's done in a fair and open and transparent manner is going to be something that we need to resolve.
Lisa, how hard have you found it to get the elected officials' attention on this issue in particular?
So I think we have people in the city right now who understand the connection of they understand that connection to the long-term solutions that we're trying to implement really are that the steps we can take now can also help with some of the shorter-term sort of emergencies and crises that we're facing. But we also we see climate adaptation or, events that are consistent with the climate models, I think yearly we already see an increased number of heat wave days. We see increased riverine flooding from flash flooding. Fells Point got 5 inches of rain in about an hour earlier this summer and flooded because of the infrastructure backup. So those connections are there on the newspaper every day as we try to make the case for additional steps to be taken.
But you're having to make the case, and I guess that's what I'm worried about. I mean, your own mayor, Jack Young, it was in August after a storm. He's quoted as having said he was unconcerned about the threat that was presented to the waterfront development by some of these extreme weather events that are increasingly occurring. And that's got to be troublesome. You know, when it looks like, according to experts, they say that by 2050, there is going to be regular flooding in the waterfront area of Baltimore, right. 2 or 3 days a week, just sunny day flooding.
But what Baltimore has been able to do, because you would think that we would be a city where the knee-jerk reaction would be, you can't do anything that would slow down development in the city. Well, a few years ago, we put in flood regulations that were well above what the federal government requires. And we enforce them, every day as we move forward. And so businesses are having to do more than the federal government requires. And so they see that connection, and it's not something we get the pushback on.
Anjali, right now in Madrid, the UN climate conference is underway. I imagine they're talking a lot about city resilience to climate change. I'm wondering, though, how heightened now the level of concern is with this new report that came out last month, where they basically discovered a more accurate way to calculate land elevation using satellite technology, satellite readings. And they found that 40 million more people than they had calculated in the past are actually now going to be in the path of high tide flooding on a regular basis by 2050. Bangkok, Shanghai, Mumbai, Basra, Iraq, Alexandria, Egypt. I mean, has this created a new sense of urgency?
It's, just talk about making the case. I mean, this really adds to that. But I will say, over the last couple of years, WRI ourselves, I mean, we've been gathering this data on how many millions of people are going to be subject to 5 meters and 10 meters of sea level rise in coastal cities, growing coastal cities which are already heavily populated, Cairo, Dhaka in Bangladesh, and now you see results like this. So I think it absolutely needs to heighten the sense of urgency. But I think a lot more work needs to go into taking that data and making intelligent policy based on it, and creating the capacity to understand the data among decision makers, planners, practitioners. All of us have this responsibility, activists, advocates, to see how this data can be utilized effectively. And this is, again, where it's not just a US problem, but internationally, some of the developing world cities, there is just no technical capacity, very limited technical capacity to take the science, which may be available to you, localize it to the city scale. Often these data are at the global scale, they're at the regional scale, country level data. Localizing it to the city context has been a major challenge. And then within that, starting to look at the impacts on segments of the population, disadvantaged communities, vulnerable communities. That further sort of layer and nuancing of interpretation is needed to kind of guide the policy. It's not happening fast enough, and I think we all need to join forces. I hope something good comes out of the COP conference in terms of an outcome and decision, just more ambition.
Carla, speaking of the disadvantaged in cities around the country, it is generally the poor who are the most vulnerable, and then they have the fewest resources to protect themselves, to prepare for climate change. So what can cities do to make sure that these efforts that they take, that they are inclusive and that they protect everyone in a city?
It's important to remember that adapting to the climate crisis is a social challenge as much as it is an environmental challenge. And I think all the approaches that we've talked about in terms of environment and science and policymaking have to always go back and look at how individual lives are affected. I've done several research projects with local environmental justice and climate justice organizations, and it's very interesting that a common thread that they always say is they're almost agnostic to the solution, whether it's tweaking their neighborhoods, actually doing broader infrastructure, or even relocation, as long as they're involved in the decisions that affect their lives and their families' lives and their communities' lives. So number one, actually listening to what your communities have to say, what solutions they come up with. I think too often, and as the window of opportunity decreases to actually do good, effective climate adaptation strategies, that opportunity to do effective community engagement is decreasing and having grassroots solutions come up. So the faster we do that, the faster we listen to neighborhoods and communities, the better. And then there are all sorts of other things, all the way through how do you get local citizens on the finance boards that decide which projects should get invested. How do you prioritize low-income neighborhoods that are most vulnerable for infrastructure development? Because these communities have historically, because of redlining and segregation in this country, been the ones to get the worst services, the worst public works, the worst infrastructure.
And they're usually in the most vulnerable locations.
That's exactly right.
Lisa and Anjali, before we go to the audience for questions, I'd like both of you to address that. You know, Lisa in Baltimore, how do you make sure that as you're making it a more resilient city, that those city resources are being spent equitably?
Right.
And then Anjali, I know you've been working on a report that looks at meeting the needs of the urban underserved and how that can make a city more resilient.
So in Baltimore, we're very aware of the parts of the city that are more vulnerable due to the decades of structural racism. And we put that at the forefront. We actually have a requirement to do an equity assessment of all of the city programs moving forward. And so how we do that in resilience, we have, and to Carlos's point about the community engagement, we've established resiliency hubs. We're at 7 or 8 right now, which are community groups in some of these neighborhoods who we are giving training, we're fundraising to give supplies so that they can be a resource in their community to make their residents more resilient. We also pay attention because those same areas are, can be 6 to 10 degrees hotter during heat waves. And so we work to try to see if we can help reduce that impact more. So it's at the forefront of what we're doing.
I should give a shout out to the Baltimore example. We've been looking into it, by the way, very carefully because you guys have excellent indicators to track equity-related outcomes of your climate plan, your sustainability plan. It's really, I think, something many cities can learn from. But yes, to your point about how we can kind of make climate action more inclusive, more equitable, I think Carlos's point is extremely important. Involve the communities. We work in the international context, and you have informal settlements that are not within the purview of any jurisdiction, any kind of planning. And you really need to work with these communities. They're the most vulnerable. In richer countries, too, you have disadvantaged areas, vulnerable areas. But I guess I also just want to make the point that, a few years ago, at WRI, we led this work, I'm talking about 8 or 9 years ago, that made the connection between environmental and climate action, greenhouse gas emission reduction, and economic benefits very clear. The two go hand in hand. It's not costly. In the long run, you have great dividends and returns from investing in greenhouse gas emissions reduction. Now the story is the same for climate adaptation. Now that we're recognizing that we're heading towards, a 4-degree warming world or whatever, with climate adaptation too, the dividends to action, I think we need to keep making that case about how its returns in terms of, development, its returns in terms of social capital and social resilience. We just need to keep highlighting that to make this case.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and FEMA makes that case. They say every dollar that's spent on disaster mitigation, prevention, will save you at least $6 in disaster recovery costs, at least, and sometimes it's $7 or $11. So it's such a great return on investment. Well, let's go to our questions. First one, and this is from Michael, on building new developments in climate risk zones. Why are banks and insurers willing to lend and insure? Who wants that one?
Because they have been doing it for a long time.
You're saying it's an old habit and we can't break it?
I think that's part of the issue. I think part of the problem is we're still relying on old models of what's possible. instead of really accepting the limitations that we have and coming up with entirely new structures. Part of the challenge is also that we have a federal government that's been recalcitrant in making climate adaptation decisions, so they don't know how to respond appropriately to decision-making, governmental decision-making. I mean, there's always been an informal pact between insurers and government, where government will create infrastructure to protect communities, and insurers will insure the properties on that land that's protected. That's broken. And infrastructure is just, existing infrastructure is already in arrears by trillions of dollars, according to ASCE. Shout out to my civil engineers. So they don't know what to do.
But I don't think, at least as cities, we assume that will continue to be the case. I think that was part of the argument, again, when Baltimore set higher than federal standards on floodplain. That was to kind of help make sure that moving forward, the buildings where they've had the new construction, that they might still be insurable and would see lower damages in the event of a storm or flooding.
All right, we have a question here from Anonymous. What is the role and good examples of community-led resilience projects? Community-led. I guess that kind of speaks a little bit to what you were saying, Anjali, doing projects with communities instead of for them.
Right. I think climate adaptation and resilience building is one of those things you'd really need stakeholders and decision makers at all scales working together, the very local neighborhood and community level, to the city level, to the regional, to the national, because the kinds of solutions that you're going to come up with are going to be much more holistic. You know, think about watersheds that suffer from climate risk, that supply water to cities, right? It's this whole chain that you need to kind of think about, which has actors acting at all levels that need to make decisions. And so we can't just say, we can say community-led, but it's really a partnership of actors that we're talking about, a partnership between communities and cities, a partnership between national governments willing to provide resources to these city neighborhood arrangements and things like that. And there's some great examples. Bangkok has implemented upgrading of all of its informal settlements through a system like that, funded by the national government, local communities working with the city government, multiplied it and scaled it up across many cities in the country and East Asia, throughout East Asia. So I think it's a powerful example.
And if I could just...
No, please, you go.
Sorry, I had my back.
We are so inspired by these local...
The advantage to be having your back to the moderator, you can jump the queue. I just wanted to add with our resiliency hubs, I wanted to make sure that these were not groups that we just sort of went in and they weren't doing any of this and we're sort of, showing them how or leading the way. These are very often groups that we identified because that's already what they were doing. A church near some Freletting and Frederick Avenue just opened up its doors and started acting as a resiliency hub. And so we came in kind of behind to just introduce them to others and provide some resources.
These are the inspirations I think that we all have, and that's why we get so passionate about these specific cases that we've seen where actual local groups are doing something. So I just want to give a couple plugs for Southwest Workers Union in San Antonio was a neighborhood-based organization, developed its own climate plan for its neighborhood that became a model for the city of San Antonio's climate plan. Catalyst Miami, who's been advocating for Miami-Dade level and Miami City climate adaptation, sits on the board for the Miami Forever bond and decides what projects get funded from that. There's so much great activism. Rebuild by Design in New York, who's been pushing extensive community engagement on major infrastructure projects, including the ones like the Big U around Lower Manhattan. These are the things that we need to be lifting up, because that's, at least personally, what inspires me in the middle of seeing headlines that say bleak, bleak, bleak. So.
Exciting to see something good happening. We need that inspiration. Thank you all. Anjali, Lisa, Carlos, you're terrific.